Hi y'all, welcome to my channel, welcome to a new video, Coldplay, Everyday Life, album review, let's talk about it. The 8th studio album from Coldplay, the British pop rock, alternative rock group that have permeated the airwaves since 2000, releasing one of their best singles, Yellow, one of my favorite songs from them, as well as Fix You from X and Y, and from A Rush of Blood to the Head, The Scientist. Coldplay has made some of my favorite music I've heard in my life, but then in 2010 they kinda faded a little bit. Not faded away, but faded away from their sound, their original sound. After the release of Viva La Vida, the band has really kind of not been as good as they used to be. Their sound came from other bands like Radiohead and inspired by Pink Floyd as well. And at the beginning of the 2010s, they started to push away from the rock sound that they were known for, releasing upbeat, more happy songs like Milo Xyloto, or their foray into art pop and downtempo on their album Ghost Stories. While I didn't mind Ghost Stories, it wasn't a terrible album. The album after it, A Head Full of Dreams, is easily panned as their worst or weakest album to date. A Head Full of Dreams was easily their most mainstream album to date, and not a lot of people enjoyed it. I, for one, didn't care for it either, so when I heard that they were going to release an album after 4 years, I was pretty interested. But I do have to note the rollout of this album has been pretty unique for Coldplay. One, they released the album and then they released the track listing on a newspaper, and then they made the statement that they weren't going to be touring for this album because of environmental issues. Then this album is released and I take a listen to it. And initially I liked Arabesque and Orphans. I didn't mind those tracks. And in the context of the record, they sound pretty nice too. However, everything around these songs, for the most part, most of the songs on this either sound unfinished or completely beneath Coldplay. And it's kind of weird because I feel like a lot of people are giving this album a pass because it's supposed to be a concept or a conscious album, when in reality, this album is the weakest concept album I've heard this year. It barely feels like a concept album. It barely feels like a theme was put into this album at all. And I also heard that this album was made because Coldplay toured the world and this is what they made. This is what they saw in the world. And, I mean, Mark Kozlik can write more profound, more meaningful, and more thought-provoking material going on an airplane. Like, seriously, you traveled the world and this is the album you put out? It feels like Chris Martin wanted to go back to their style, but also wanted to do some weird experimentation. Like, look, if Chris Martin can have a side project that he can put all of this stuff in, I'd be fine with that. But this doesn't feel like a Coldplay album, rather a Chris Martin album +3. Because what made Coldplay a good band is how well all of these aspects work together. The drumming, the guitars, the vocals, the singing, the lyrics, everything. And yet barely any of it comes together on this album, when sometimes you have an iPhone memo of Chris Martin literally strumming away and singing some lyrics. And look, there is a mellow, more introspective side to this album that I can appreciate, but please don't fool me with this "it's everyday life, it's supposed to be rough around the edges" kind of mentality. I see why people might subscribe to that mindset on this album, but this is a very weak attempt at trying to string together songs. Again, I like some of the aspects of this album, the sentimental aspects of this album, the melodic aspects of this album, the warmer side to this album is very nice. I like the horns on the track Arabesque, and I also like Orphans. I think it's a good return to what Coldplay were doing back in their heyday. Everyday Life isn't that bad of a tune, even if it does sound painfully similar to Everybody Hurts. I mean, it has the same styling and title. But you cannot fool me that the underproduced, unfinished demos on this album are on purpose. Seriously, why do some of the songs on here just sound not finished at all? The 6th track on the first disc of this thing, did I mention it's a double disc album too? But again, the 6th track on the first disc of this album sounds like Chris Martin strumming away, and he's just recording into an iPhone microphone like the one I'm using to help make the audio for this video a thing. The song Guns, the song Ico. Sunrise just sounds like this ambient interlude that's the beginning of the album. And I see why people might be hyping this up as Coldplay's best album this decade. And I agree. It is their best album this decade. But by default. Because would I rather listen to Milo Xyloto over this? No. Would I rather listen to Ghost Stories over this? No. Would I rather listen to A Head Full of Dreams over this? No. So just by default, this album is the superior one of the bunch. But not even by the biggest margin, because still, some of Coldplay's weakest songs end up on this album. And maybe a good Coldplay track that's memorable ends up on this album, like Arabesque. Again, Orphans as well. It's like the trailer to a movie where all the jokes are in the trailer, so you watch the movie and you already know the jokes that happen, and the only funny ones are the jokes in the trailer. And speaking of movies, the concept of everyday life on this album, I talked about earlier, but again, I don't subscribe to that mindset because it's just rough around the edges. It's supposed to be like that. That's just a cheap way of saying it's unfinished. Imagine a movie, again, that is someone's everyday life. And what you see them doing is waking up in the morning, brushing their teeth, getting breakfast, getting ready for work. It's like this hour-long, just nothingness, nothing's exciting, nothing's happening. Why am I watching this? There are albums that have more concept than this album. This is easily one of the worst concept albums I've heard this year. But I'm not even looking at it as a concept album because it's a Coldplay album. Their albums have never been conceptual. Why now? Is it just a weird, like, one-off thing that they want to do? I don't know. But it seriously, to me, doesn't seem like a genuine commitment to a conscious and conceptual album. It just feels like a cheap way to string all of these songs together and call it a concept album. That does not excuse the painfully unfinished and underproduced songs on this album. They don't sound unique or natural or organic. They sound lazy and unfinished. Even at their best, Coldplay sounded like a great Radiohead ripoff, but on this album, the song Everyday Life sounds like a bad REM ripoff. I would choose any album that Coldplay made in the aughts over this album, but this album does win amongst all the other albums that Coldplay released this decade. And I mean, again, that was a low bar to jump over, and at least they jumped over it. I'm glad for them, because it's somewhat a return to format on this album, but it's not a return to form. No way it is. Because all the charm, all the attitude, and all of the feelings that Coldplay emitted in their older material just isn't on this album. Again, if Chris Martin had a side project that he could put all of this stuff in, I'd be fine with that. But again, this sounds like Chris Martin plus 3. It doesn't sound like a genuine Coldplay project. I guess really the positives I can say about this album, there are a few. I like how eclectic some of this sounds. It does sound a little worldly at some points, even though it's just, again, slightly cheap. And I kind of feel like Chris Martin is making the music that he genuinely wants to make, but he really needs to buff out the edges, really. At its best, this album can be pretty sentimental and pretty engaging, but at its worst, it's unfinished demos that should have stayed on the cutting room floor, honestly. So personally, I would give this album a C+. It is in some way the best Coldplay album of the decade, but not their best album. Not their best album. Outro. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on this album down below. Let me know what albums you want me to review next, and that is it. Leave a like, comment, share, do whatever you want. Let me know how I can improve future videos down below, and remember, this is only my opinion because music is subjective.